I've always thought of gifts as dangerous when they come wrapped too brightly. I've been allergic to gold paper since I was young, because gold doesn't hide luxury. It hides the intent to blind you. The envelope gleamed on my kitchen table as if it hadn't been put there by people, but by a billboard off the interstate. I ran my finger along the thick edge and felt the roughness of pressed cardboard, the kind you find in bills of lading and insurance forms. Things that bind you to obligations are always built to last. I tore the envelope open and pulled out a ticket. There it was: sunshine, ocean, the promise of a tan, and one innocent little phrase that ruined everything. One way. No return segment, no booking code for a flight back. The ticket lay in my palm, slick like fish skin, reflecting nothing but a trap. Inside the envelope was also a voucher for some coastal resort. A package, as the travel agents say, all inclusive. I know how to deal with keys. My whole life has been held together by keys. Keys to the yard where trucks spent the night. Keys to warehouse cages stacked with straps and tie-downs. Keys to the office safe where credit lines gathered dust. And one key, the key, wasn't like the rest. Small, lacquered black, unmarked. A locksmith once made it on a whim of my late husband. He laughed, saying it was safer this way. I didn't laugh. I just memorized it by touch. The head of the key warm, the teeth sharp, the metal heavy, almost greasy. That key led to myself, to the iron cabinet in a warehouse across the interstate, where copies of the trust papers were kept, the incorporation documents of my little trucking business, the emergency cash, and a flash drive with the accounting archive. When he died, I left that key hanging on the cabinet as a sign. Memory isn't candles in a church, it's folders with seals. I looked at the ticket again and felt my neck turn cold. I could almost hear the squeal of a semi's brake pad on a downhill grade. The moment when the weight starts dragging you down, and if you don't catch the pedal, you're spinning out. I had no doubts where the envelope came from. You can always hear it in a voice when it isn't about you, but about your square footage, your dollars, and your account balance. Those voices are recognizable by the words they don't contain. No work, no gratitude, only numbers. And numbers always sit next to the word mom. I didn't call anyone. I did what I always do: put on the kettle, spread my documents across the table, checked the dates, and slowly packed a small suitcase. Not the shiny roller one, but the old one with a stiff lock that hates sudden moves. The suitcase smelled like a cargo van, hot asphalt, and the cheap hand soap from a busted bathroom at the yard. I packed a few changes of clothes, a windbreaker, a pill box for my heart meds, a graph paper notebook, and the black key in a small zippered pocket. The ticket I didn't hide. Let it sit in the kitchen drawer next to linen napkins and paper clips. From there, it had the best view of masks falling off. I walked to the lot and slid into my pickup. The truck held a line on the highway better than most people hold their word. The engine answered with a low growl, and I pulled away as if I were just hauling another load. No names, no goodbyes. At the first gas station, I poured coffee from a sticky button machine, grabbed a candy bar, and, eyes on the map on my screen, chose the road with the longest stretches free of cameras. In this kind of logistics, there are no secrets. Only the habit of skipping unnecessary stops. The wind through the side window carried me to a motel off the interstate, where the carpets reeked of cheap disinfectant, the AC groaned like a tired dog, and the front desk was run by a woman with a worn face and steel manicure. I paid in cash and pushed my suitcase under the desk, so that I only needed to tilt my head to see its edge. This was my shelter, my first checkpoint. I was at home in this no home, rooms with doors facing the parking lot, where you can hear strangers' cars staying strangers until dawn. I lay on the coverlet without closing my eyes. The ticket whimpered in the kitchen of my imagination, like a puppy I hadn't picked up. Where the return flight should have been, there yawned the joy of those who had planned this mercy. I didn't cry. I was born dry. I only touched the pocket where the black key rested and noted it was still warm. As if inside the metal lived a spark I fanned, not with breath, but with memory. What was at stake wasn't square footage or salary. It was my voice. If I left with that ticket, they'd tell my story for me, in whatever way suited them. If I stayed silent, they'd paint me voiceless anyway. That meant I had to speak in numbers, seals, transfers, and roots. I fell asleep the way a string snaps, instantly, quietly, with a metallic taste on my tongue. The morning unfolded slowly, like the long dash on a bill of lading. Date, place, signature. I got up and felt my foot slip on an invisible step. That drop happens when you realize you're not afraid anymore. My kind of fear is simple and useful. I call it inspection. I drove out early, before the housekeeper could knock on my door, and turned toward the industrial zone. The sorting centers roared there like oceans in concrete walls, and to the east, a line of teenagers stretched toward their morning shifts. I knew a little window where copies were notarized without questions, and I knew a lawyer who never asked any ahead of time. His last name didn't sound noble, but his signature carried the weight it needed to, especially when property and shares were on the line. I paid with the company card, the same company people still assumed was mine, just yesterday, and instantly felt the air shift around me. When money moves through a corporation, the world speaks to you differently. At the credit union, I finally signed a document I'd been cowardly putting off with the excuse of later. On that paper appeared a trust, a cold word, but with warmth buried inside it. I named as the sole beneficiary not a person, but conditions. Conditions are always more honest than people. And those conditions sounded like my childhood: work, discipline, deadlines, proof. I set rules that gave blood a chance, but only if it labored. Now it was time for the black key. I parked by the warehouse where the yard puddle swelled into a round little lake after rain and climbed the iron stairs to the second floor. The key slid in softly, like a habit, and clicked in a way I felt in my knees. The folders were in place. My husband's shoulder in its picture frame looked at me guiltily from the top shelf. I didn't talk to the photo. I just checked the flash drive was where it should be. The cash stacked exactly as I had left it. I never trusted safety deposit boxes at banks. Too polished, too many strangers' hands between you and your tomorrow. The iron cabinet in a dusty warehouse was closer to home. I pulled a thin packet from my suitcase, slipped off the rubber band, placed the freshly notarized trust papers inside, and straightened them with a fingernail, as if neatness could alter fate. At the same table, I laid out my plan. At the bottom of the page was one line: airport. I wasn't planning to fly. What I needed was a big hall where people loved to watch other people's drama. The hunger of a crowd would be my free spotlight, and I needed a place where all the players would gather. Let them think they're sending me off with fanfare. In reality, they'd be signing me my stage lights. I could feel the stakes shifting. Yesterday, it was just my loneliness on the line. Today, it was my whole story. I'd give up any possessions to keep my memory, But they chose the possessions. That meant memory would become my weapon. Back at the motel, my phone showed dozens of notifications. Missed calls, loud, sticky, as if someone had broken a finger and typed screams with it. I silenced the phone and set it face down. I knew this pattern well. First come the soft messages of love, then the urgent request to quickly send account numbers to ensure your comfort abroad. Comfort is the word they wrap a knife in when they're about to serve you cold. I ate the cold potato left over from last night and allowed myself one luxury, a short nap. I needed my head steady. Soon would come the fake power of attorney forms, the notary, miracles, the rushed explanations for why my signature must go down today. I had seen it dozens of times in the stories whispered through the waiting rooms of adult protective services. What always amazed me was this. Why do criminals always pick such a boring sauce as care? By midday, I drove back to the company yard. The air smelled of diesel, stale candy bars, and wet cardboard. The loading ramps creaked. I stood at the gate where my last name once hung in heavy letters. I knew time was short. If they had gotten ahead of me, they'd already be jamming sticks into the wheels. Insurance policies, permits, anything they could twist. I slipped into the shabby office, shut the door behind me, and pulled a metal wallboard off its magnets. Behind it was a niche where, years ago, almost casually, I had taped a flat device, my personal recorder. It drained fast, like a man who doesn't know how to eat on schedule, but when it mattered, it held on long. I wanted it to hold on again. I pressed its tiny button, saw the glow, and tucked it into my suitcase. By evening, I received an email from the insurance broker. Confirmation of beneficiary changes on both transport and life policies. In the comments, he noted they were now tied to the trust. I read his wording and smiled without smiling. That's what invisible architecture of defense looks like. No one builds you a concrete wall until you've drawn the blueprint. At the end of the day, I finally opened the motel fridge and poured water into a flimsy cup. With that water came the realization. The price had gone up. Everything was more expensive now. My name, my truth, my silence. I'd never been religious. But that night, for the first time in years, I prayed. My prayer was dry. Let me have the endurance not to switch to their language. The day split me in two. First, I went to the county records office, where a line of people leaned on plastic stools like the sides of rowboats. Most of them had eyes trained to read fine print. Fine print is the real language of this world. I handed over my packet to register the changes. The clerk raised an eyebrow at my disciplined folder but said nothing. In his silence, I heard respect for people who show up with a plan. Then I had to go back to the yard because on the gate cameras, I noticed a strange car. Inside sat him. The man who had driven a wedge through my family quietly and confidently, like a driver convinced everyone else holds a crooked license. At moments like that, I feel heat between my shoulder blades, as if someone pressed a metal ruler there, one that had survived a schoolyard war. I didn't come close. I watched from the cab of my pickup through the binoculars I'd kept in the glove box for years, next to tissues and an old safety vest. The man got out, dropped a white folder on the sidewalk, picked it up, and walked into the office. I instantly recognized the words stamped on the cover: power of attorney, authorization. In that moment, I knew the pause was over. They were taking the short road. I hit the gas, not toward the yard, but into downtown, because the plan had already changed I had to pull the business out of the line of fire. Right now. I met with a competitor, the one many called a predator. I choose predators because their rules are clear. He gave me a restrained nod when he saw the asset sale documents in my hands. We didn't shake hands. I don't play games. He named figures slightly below market value, but cash, transparent, without any attempt to tug at my nerves. I agreed. My nerves were already dead center targets in someone else's scheme. The deal happened fast, like a pallet loaded by an experienced forklift driver. Movement showed up in my credit union account. I pushed almost everything under the trust and built guardrails so no clerk could take a step on the strength of some sugary phone call. Now, if anyone tried to stage a scene about my mental instability, they'd smash into concrete. Independent evaluations required, personal presence mandatory. Back at the motel, I saw the usual red notification blinking on my phone like a warning beacon. I let myself be weak and opened one message. It was full of congratulations about my new dream and a sweetness that made the room colder. I powered the phone off for good. In the dirty mirror, I saw the face of a woman, tired of being a stage prop in someone else's play. That's when I remembered the recorder in my suitcase. I pulled it out, checked the charge, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. From now on, any hand brushing against my things would be caught on record. That evening, I drove to the yard again, but not through the front. I slipped in through the side gate, the one only people who'd locked it on long winters knew. The office door was ajar. I stepped inside, quiet as a shadow, and saw the white folder on the desk. Next to it lay a stack of forms, the kind an experienced eye spots instantly. Fresh printouts with X marks pre-filled in spots where whisperers suggest you sign now or never. I didn't touch them. I crouched and looked under the desk. There, where I used to leave old gloves and a water bottle, lay what I feared most, a small fob with a black strap. My key. Had someone lifted it from my house? I didn't remember taking it out late at night while packing. I picked it up, rolled the cold metal in my palm. Metal doesn't lie. It wasn't mine. It was its twin. They'd made a copy. Only thieves certain of a click try a lock. I smiled without humor. I don't believe in perfect copies. Every key has its invisible scar. Mine carried a scratch at the fifth tooth. This one didn't. They'd made a toy, something to slip in place of the real thing. That meant only one thing. They had access to my house, my drawers, my golden envelope in the kitchen. I pulled down the empty hook where the plaque once hung. Long halls? And I knew. There would be no turning back. All lines were already laid. The next stop on my plan sat inside a thick black frame. Airport. I never liked noisy places, but noise was exactly what I needed. I needed people, cameras, security, lines, departure boards, flashing delays. I needed a hall where truth rings louder than slamming doors. I spent a night that deserves to be called bad. At 3 a.m, I thought someone was knocking on my door. It was only the air conditioner banging, the pipes moaning. I lay there and felt cold slowly seeping into me. It wasn't fear, it was exhaustion. By 4, I sat up and began to write by hand. A cardboard folder, lined paper, blue ink. I listed facts, dates, sums, invoice numbers, milestones of my life in the only language this world respects. Markers. Each entry was a strap, tightened around someone else's lie. I wrote without rhetoric, like drafting a bill of lading. Long years had taught me this. When you work with freight, words must be in their place. Otherwise, The load slips on the first bump. In the morning, I drove by my house, only to understand that returning wasn't an option. The doorway looked rounder than usual. On the doormat lay a business card from an agency that likes to check if the elderly are being mistreated. Expected. Procedure. Someone had called. Someone had voiced concern. I picked up the card, flipped it over, and set it back down. Forms of care always start with paper. The black key lay warm in my jacket pocket, the real one. Solid faith in metal steadied me enough not to step inside. I knew the traps were already set there. Things misplaced, accessories gone, medicines swapped. I knew the script of incompetence by heart. Couldn't find the key, left the stove on, forgot to turn off the tap, forgot the way home. Words written in a cluttered kitchen by someone else's hand. I chose to turn the wheel instead, keep driving the circle until noon, when it led me where I needed to be. The airport. The baggage counter called to me in his voice, but I didn't answer. I stood in the stream of travelers holding not a suitcase, but the envelope. That envelope was my anchor now. On the second floor, I found the place where the floor is scrubbed most often, where people say goodbye. There, the air smelled of disinfectant and almonds. I laid the folder of my written statements on my lap and read through them as if rehearsing evacuation instructions. Around me, people ate bagels, hugged children, dropped travel-heavy bodies into chairs. I needed that roar. If there's any fair acoustics on Earth, it's in places where everyone's rushing and no one has time to finish their performance. I spotted them early. Their movements looked like those of people withdrawing cash. They walked as if cameras clung to them from every angle. They no longer knew how to live without cameras. I rose and moved toward them. And in that moment, I felt the warmth slip away from under my jacket. The key in my pocket had cooled. Fatigue ran down my spine like a thin, icy finger. In their hands was something white, a fresh printout, maybe a document notarized too quickly. I veered left toward the check-in line. On the wall hung a screen with rules for transporting dangerous goods. It reminded me, there is no cargo more dangerous than human lies. You can't pack it right. It will always leak. At the line that divides those who depart from those who stay, a security officer approached me. He asked something I didn't hear. I handed him the folder and the ticket. Let him read first. Let him be surprised, even if he was used to being tired. I watched as the words on my pages did their work. He read fast. Tired people read fast. He nodded and gave the folder back. And in his eyes, I saw what I had built all this noise for. Not pity, recognition. The kind that speaks without words. After that, I sat down with the folder on my lap and stayed that way as long as needed, until the world tightened around me like a net around a fish. From there, everything went as my writing had ordered. They brought me care on a white sheet of paper. I spread my report in front of them. In the bewildered silence born right there, I felt the metal wire strung through these days stop cutting my skin. It felt as if shoes finally stopped scraping the floor. The habit of winning without a lunge sat down beside me on an empty chair. For a moment, I thought it would all end too cleanly. I was wrong. The ending decided to make another lap. That was when news of multiple flight delays rippled through the hall. The crowd thickened into a hum. Arrows flashed on the board. People turned to droplets. And in droplets, colors dissolve easier. Someone tried to play pity. I saw burning eyes inside a glazed shell, I saw the intent to yank the envelope from my hands and wave it like a flag. They wanted to spin me into a farewell dance and claim it had always been planned this way. But between me and that choreography stood the thick folder in my own handwriting. I lifted it higher and felt my hands tremble. It wasn't weakness. It was metal. Striking metal. I wasn't holding papers. I was holding a bridge. By evening, I walked outside. The air was clear, like warm glass. My cheeks ached as if after a long winter shift on the ramps. I drove away alone, the same way I'd arrived, only lighter. At the motel parking lot, a note was tucked under my wiper. It overflowed with words of love. The paper reeked of cheap cologne. I tore it, not with anger, but with tenderness, for paper that deserved a better fate. Everything that had to be lost was already lost. My illusion that blood was a guarantee. My neurosis that things had to stay untouched to avoid offense. My fake nobility of silence, all gone. And suddenly, space opened wide. The night after the airport, I gathered a new packet of papers. This time, it wasn't just facts, but rules. I drafted an instruction to donate part of my funds to a foundation that gives small grants to families of drivers injured on the line. It was my answer to a world that prefers to count not the money, but the consequences. I went back to the credit union in the morning when the air still smelled of floor cleaner and machine coffee, and handed the clerk a document for automatic payment. The paper was as simple as a check. Simplicity is the best shield against someone else's hysterical conscience. Then I drove to my lawyer. His office was always cool, even when the asphalt outside clung to your shoes. He laid out the moves my enemies might make now that they were officially cut out. His words carried the familiar rhythm of law. Allegations of incompetence, appeals to agencies, beatings with facts in the right accents. Formulas didn't scare me. I like formulas because they're predictable. Together, we built a plan in case their tantrum turned legal. I left in his folder an instruction for access to my personal recorder and another document that was even pleasant to sign. An order not to waste time on family theatrics. Midday brought a call from the department that loves to check. We spoke briefly. They asked questions. I answered the way forms are filled out, carefully, with dates, no frills, no complaints. They offered a personal interview. I said yes and drove to the far side of town, where serious people look you straight in the eye. I sat in a small room on a plastic chair and told a stranger my life like it was a route map. He nodded and made notes. He had kind shoulders. He ended with a simple phrase. He had no reason to consider me vulnerable. A strange pride rushed over me, the thrill of an adult student passing a hard exam without a cheat sheet. On the way back, I stopped at the yard for the last time. The black key clicked in the lock like a metronome. My iron cabinet smelled of paper, metal, and dusty light. I pulled out the flash drive, plugged it into an old laptop with half its keys dead. Numbers, dates, accounts, scans came alive on the screen. This was my geography. I made a copy and slipped it into a small envelope, hiding it in my truck's glove box between a rag and a pair of gloves. I drove toward the stretch of highway that curves in a long arc and pulls cars into itself like water into a funnel. At the edge of a suburb where signs economize on words, I stopped at a food stand and bought a box of fried food. I ate standing by my truck, watching people in work boots. I love their faces. They carry truths that never need to be proven later. They only wish the world would deal with them without theater. So do I. That evening, I drove to a small cabin on a hill, one I'd looked at back in spring when I was thinking about silence without heroics. The cabin stood on a lot with a pine hooking the sky. The owner was ready for a quick deal. She had a son in college and was tired of debt. I signed a preliminary contract and put down a deposit. The paper crackled. Sometimes the crackle of paper is applause the world finally buys from you honestly. Before bed, I took the black key from my suitcase and set it on the nightstand. I wanted to see it beside me. I realized, strangely, that it no longer belonged to the cabinet. It belonged to me without the cabinet. It had become a symbol not of access, but of exit. My husband had wanted me to have a key that could open any dead end. I finally understood. This was it. The next morning brought news. The two who had rehearsed their care so long started telling the world I was a monster, and they were victims of circumstances and bad influences. I didn't read the words. I just watched how the word care clung to rotten wood like green mold. It made me sick. I don't know how and don't want to answer in kind. All I know is how to work. I loaded the leftovers of my office into the small truck, pulled two framed photos from the house, and tossed in a plastic bin full of buttons and staplers. The sort of thing you always grab when you move. On the interstate, I passed trucks I would never see at my yard again. Each one had its own road, its own driver's knee, its own pain in the cold, and, God willing, a hot thermos. I wished them a smooth road in their heads. I wished myself the same. I moved into the new cabin at sunset. The pine creaked in the wind as if speaking to someone unseen. Inside smelled of lime and dust from old furniture. I set my suitcase on the floor, took out the black key, and placed it on a shelf the way people set a photo on a mantel. I brewed a tea bag. It turned out tea can smell like victory if you drink it from a cup you bought yourself and carried into your home yourself. I opened my notebook and began to take stock. On paper, it looked like I had done the impossible quickly. Inside, it hadn't been quick at all. Inside, it had been long, like a dragging rain. Reading my own numbers, I didn't see sums. I saw steps. Each step was a foothold. On one, I left the ticket. On another, a piece of skin. On another, the smile I'd once handed out in this family as easily as a supermarket coupon. Nearly a week after moving in, a letter arrived. Yellowed envelope, dull glue, an address scrawled by a hand that had forgotten straight lines. Inside was text trying to be a confession. Promises of correction, attempts to rewrite the story, so my victory made me a lifelong culprit. I felt old habits rising like steam from a kettle. Habits that whisper, yield, excuse, leave them a chance. I know how to leave chances. Chances were my profession. I left them to sluggish forklifts, silly mistakes on bills of lading, winter outages. But I would not leave one to betrayal. I burned the letter in the fireplace. Ash swirled easily and mixed with smoke that smelled of pine and sticky summer. In that moment, I understood the ending wouldn't be outrageous, and it wouldn't be cheerful with laughter. It would be bitter bright. Bitterness is needed to remember. Brightness is needed to live. The surprise didn't come from those I expected, another round of fakery or a staged repentance. It came differently. One day, in the roadside mailbox, I found a small package. Inside was a fob, black, same size and weight as mine. But the tiny scratch sat in a different place. I ran my finger along the metal and knew this wasn't my cabinet key. In the package lay a note without greeting or signature. On the paper were coordinates and a small locator icon. I drove there immediately. Navigation lives in my blood now, no extra questions. The coordinates led me to a warehouse across a roaring highway where people lived on short-term leases. I opened a cage lock and found a filing cabinet. Inside were printouts of messages saved earlier than most. Plans made for me the way prisons are made. Calculations of property values, an estimate of my house, lists of what to clear out the day I was gone, orders for private investigations, lists of keys to my home. On top lay a flash drive. I brought it back to the cabin and opened it on the old laptop. The files came alive. Only those who want the world to live without memory disbelieve in records. Memory is the hardest law. The files were time-stamped recordings of them discussing me, my ability to control everything, and the weaknesses they decided to build their project on. One file was a copy of a phone video from that airport day. On it, I saw not only my pages and my back, but the face of a young woman, 20 years old, raised on sugar-coated explanations. On her face sat truth, like a bird that had chosen its own hand. I never learned who had placed the package in my mailbox. It could have been anyone near our performance who smelled the red stench of lies. It could have been her. It could have been the security officer who read my sheets and remembered, for once, that his signature mattered. It could even have been the competitor who bought my company and decided in his own way to close the ledger in a world where respect comes only after full payment. I didn't find out. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to accept help anonymously, without thank yous, without debt. This key didn't open locks. It opened something inside me I'd long bricked up. I placed all the printouts into a different folder. On the cover, I wrote one word in large letters: lesson. Not for them. They'd get theirs from reality, in the form of creditors, food bank lines, and night shifts in warehouses. The lesson was for me. It was this: never surrender your story to those who talk about care as if they're selling door-to-door insurance. Never confuse blood with entitlement. Never leave blank fields for someone else's golden paper hands to fill. There must always be a black key, not metal, but inside you, clicking at the right moment to close off a dead end. There must always be a suitcase, not for escape, but to gather yourself. There must always be ash, so you remember what you chose and watch the wind carry away other people's arguments. After that, life began, quiet, sharp, proper. A neighbor brought me old boards for shelves. I planed them with a chisel that dulled on the first day. I drove the interstate to a nearby town and bought cheap toolboxes and mismatched kitchen scraps at clearance. I learned to love empty Sundays by the fireplace, when nothing else demanded a signature. I walked mornings to the pond beyond the hill, where a wild duck had claimed the deeper water. I wanted to believe my silence wouldn't turn into sweet, stagnant water. I made it work. In the evenings, I sat at the table and opened the same graph paper notebook. I didn't write about pain or glory. I wrote down the names of drivers our new fund had helped with small grants. Beneath the names were notes of their injuries, surgery dates, overdue bills, and the little things that unexpectedly fix a day, like a new seat in the cab or a warm jacket without holes. One night, a thought crawled into the cabin that maybe I could forgive. I didn't brush it off. I set it down opposite me on the table. On a sheet, I wrote the word price. I ran my finger over it. There's no romance in that word. To forgive is to agree to play furniture in someone else's theater. I am not furniture. I am steel and paper. I am a person who pays in time, not in someone else's words. I closed the notebook and heard the pine rubbing against the wall outside. The sound was rough and honest, like a signature on a real contract. The ending turned out bitter bright, not because the world had suddenly become fair. Justice doesn't come suddenly. It doesn't come at all unless you drag it yourself. The light in my ending came from labor, the bitterness from blood. I fell asleep, looking at the black key on the shelf. It didn't promise new doors. It reminded me that no one-way ticket can take you somewhere without your language and your hands. As long as you have those two, you always have a way back. Not to the ones who invented a paradise without a return trip, but back to yourself. And that was the most valuable load I had ever delivered to its end.